Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We are pleased to host this conversation on the Death in Custody Reporting Act, the federal law meant to shed some light on the darkest corners of our criminal legal system. My name is Sarah Turberville, and I direct the Constitution Project here at the Project on Government Oversight at POGO. At POGO, we seek to expose when the government engages in corruption and abuse of power and seek solutions that will better ensure that the government hews to constitutional principles. Our organization is one that is working to evolve into an entity that really centers justice and equity in the work that we do. And for us, it's hard to imagine a responsibility more paramount of the government than its obligation to protect people in its custody. But I think we all know, at least anecdotally, that it too often fails to do that most basic of jobs. And in recognition of that problem, the Congress has passed into law something called the Death in Custody Reporting Act. And the central purpose of this law is modest. It's basically supposed to tell us how many people are dying in custody and why. And it's the Department of Justice's responsibility to implement it. But just last month, we released a report with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights detailing DOJ's failure to give a public accounting of the scope of deaths that are happening in the government's custody. And of course, we gave DOJ plenty of recommendations on how it can fully implement the law. Our fantastic panelists will share more in a moment. So let me tell you who these wonderful and knowledgeable folks are here with us on screen. I'll start with Bree Spencer. Bree serves as the Interim Senior Program Director of the Justice Team at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She spearheads the organization's advocacy on a variety of justice system and law enforcement reform issues for one of the nation's premier civil rights organizations. She is also a commissioner on Milwaukee's Fire and Police Oversight Commission. Liyah Brown is the director of the Justice Project at Advancement Project, where she serves the movement for racial justice where it intersects with the criminal legal system. She began her legal career as a public defender in DC and has litigated inhumane conditions, police use of force, right to counsel, bail, and public records lawsuits in federal, state, and local courts throughout Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida. And finally, we have our own David Janovsky, who is an analyst with the Constitution Project here at POGO. David researches and develops policy reforms on separation of powers issues, particularly involving Congress and DOJ, with a particular emphasis as of late on deaths in custody. David has also worked as a research assistant at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he contributed to an analysis of the response to the Boston Marathon bombing. All right, so I have just a couple logistics before we dive in for all the folks who are joining us. First, this is not a series of presentations, this is a conversation. I'll ask a few questions to get us started, but then I want to turn pretty quickly to you, the audience, to help our panelists field your questions that you might have. If you'd like to ask a question, please just use the raise your hand feature or post your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to them as quickly as we can. We'll also be sharing some resources in the chat, places where you can go to get more information, as well as where you could go to take some action. All right, so with that, let's get started. And I'll start with Liyah. Liyah, in DC, we can get wonky and into the weeds of federal policy pretty quickly. And so I'd love it if you could zoom out our camera lens a little bit and talk about the human lives behind the Death in Custody Reporting Act. And why is it that we even need to have a law like this to begin with?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for having me. So we're bringing our partners and like real people's lives to the Beltway. I've heard like some pundit talk about that on the news. And so this is an opportunity you're inviting me in to bring our partners into the Beltway area, right? So that's how I'm showing up in this conversation in part. And so first and foremost, like what we're talking about here, that's in custody in the Reporting Act. This is the bare minimum of what we're actually talking about when we have conversations about oversight and transparency. And the bare minimum of the bare minimum is having accurate reporting, just an accurate sense of what is going on. And so it's the stats are horrible, right? Like the numbers, the percentages, the underreporting, like all these numbers. And I guess I'm called in to speak to the lives, right? And to the human toll. What we're talking about is that the United States government, the United States, like one of the world's mass incarcerator. So the mass incarcerator locks people up, takes people into custody, meaning strips people of their liberty, their human right to liberty, and cannot tell us today how many people are dying in its custody. And so we're talking about the bare minimum of the most egregious, right, violations when people have their liberty stripped. And so for me, I don't sit in the Hill, or where the policymakers at that level often, but the Advancement Project, we work with people who are trying to build power to, shut down jails and prisons and facilities and do all sorts of things because the federal government, the state government, and the local government cannot be trusted to keep their loved ones safe while at the same time confining them.
Thank you, Liyah, and I'm hopeful that later on in the conversation, you'll be able to speak more to some of these questions about what we do know about who is being confined and why they are dying. David, I want to turn to you now, and maybe you can narrow our focus a bit and tell us about the law that's supposed to do this bare minimum, as Liyah described, right? Like, when was it passed? What are the relevant bits that people should care about?
Sure, and I think it really is important to keep in mind as we're talking about how the law has been a failure for going on a decade now. We are talking about truly the bare minimum. The law, the Death in Custody Reporting Act, broadly requires 3 steps. It requires states to report to the Department of Justice information on who dies in the custody of state and local agencies. And the law defines custody quite broadly. So it really, anytime from the moment someone is in an interaction with a police officer and they're not free to leave, all the way through when someone is confined, has been sentenced to, serve time in a prison, and any situation in between those moments. So that's the first component. The second component is that federal law enforcement and corrections agencies are required to report this data as well. And the third component is that it requires the Justice Department to study this data and report to Congress on how it can be used to reduce deaths in custody, how to prevent deaths in the future. And I'll add as a final note, the law empowers the Attorney General to withhold some funding from states that don't comply with the law. The Justice Department obviously gives a huge amount of money to state and local police and corrections agencies through a variety of sources. One of them is the Byrne Justice Assistance Grant Program. And the Death in Custody Reporting Act lets DOJ withhold up to 10% of those grant funds from states. And just for a little bit of context, in the last 15 or so years, well over $7 billion has flowed to the states through that program. So in the aggregate, we are talking about a pretty significant stick attached to the law.
And David, is it safe to say that federal funding goes to law enforcement agencies, right? It goes to jails, it goes to corrections facilities. And those could be some of the very same places where people are dying through a variety of different circumstances while they are in custody.
Yes, those funds would go from the federal government to the very agencies that are required to report the data, and that means that are potentially killing people in their custody.
And so how often has DOJ withheld this 10%? Has it enacted this penalty on states?
Never. The law's been in place since 2014, and the Justice Department has never even defined what compliance would be, let alone penalized a state for non-compliance. So we have a long way to go, and I'll certainly be happy to get more into the details of, how far we are from compliance as this conversation goes on. But we are a long way from compliance, and an even longer way from anyone feeling a penalty for not complying.
Well, here I'd like to bring Bree into the conversation to talk a little bit more about what DOJ is or is not doing. How do we know that the Death in Custody Reporting Act isn't being carried out properly?
Yeah, well, we know from a few different directions that it's not fully implementing this law. We know from the government itself, because last fall, a committee hearing was done on DCRA implementation, and there was a request made to the GAO to do a report, like an audit of how the data collection is going. And the Government Affairs Office found that just in 1 year alone, in 2021 alone, the Bureau of Justice Assistance had undercounted deaths at the state level by 990 in a single year. So that's an official government report done by people who research for the government, right? We also know from the fact that academic researchers and journalists have more information than the federal government does about these deaths. So we're able to see reporting and research at the state level. There's some broad-based databases. One was just launched recently at UCLA, where they wanted to study the impacts of COVID and COVID deaths in jails. But very quickly after they started that work, they realized the overall data that was available about deaths in general, you would need that too to figure out the impact of COVID deaths, and that there was this broader issue, and they were able to collect a lot of data themselves. And so, we are in our report that we wrote with POGO, and David and I working together on this issue are asking ourselves constantly why it is that smaller organizations, academic, researchers, reporters, sometimes who are doing everything on a shoestring budget, are able to get more information than the federal government itself, which is the body that is actually responsible for the well-being of people in its custody. And then finally, I think we know it's not working and the DOJ isn't doing its job because there are still a lot of preventable deaths happening. There are people dying right now in jails, prisons, and police custody whose deaths are entirely preventable. We're talking about people showing up to hospital for treatment for sepsis, which means there was stuff going on way before they got there that could have been addressed medically. We're talking about people who died by suicide in jails. And we have researchers who have shown correlations between, for example, solitary confinement and people dying by suicide. So that's the way I like to think of it. The government knows, they told us. Academics and researchers, journalists know, they tell us. And the deaths themselves and the nature of the deaths, they tell us that this isn't. That this law has not been fully implemented, that the DOJ is failing in its duty.
Thanks, Bree. What you've just described, I feel like there's also a whole nother segment of our communities, right, and our populations who know too, and that's people who are confined and family members of people who are detained or in custody. And Liyah, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit more about, without the data, right, without these numbers, to be able to sort of find in the aggregate like systemic problems. What do we know, right? Like I've heard you talk about this before about like community members, like family members, they know what's happening inside these facilities. And so I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit for our for folks who are joining us today.
Yeah, part of that involves like defining our terms. And so here we're talking about data in the way that the Department of Justice and like, like the formal kind of what we think about data formally. And there's another kind of data, and that is people's actual lived experience, their actual lived experience, and then the lived experience of their loved ones and their families. And so I think of data in this context. I live in DC, you can hear it. The way I think of maybe cell phones or like cell phones, if we're thinking about police violence, like, on the streets, like it happens. And we know that the deaths in custody are happening from, all the across the spectrum that David was speaking of, right? Like on the back end in terms of people in facilities of confinement, but also in police cars, in police cars after lockup, on the way to stuff. And so we know anecdotally, and I put anecdotally in quotes because sometimes that's not considered people's lived experience and what we talk about with our neighbors and our loved ones and about what's happening is not considered sometimes data, but we know what the situation is in the same way that we knew or at least Black people knew that the police do not keep us safe and that in fact they commit violence against us. But then when we introduced cell phone footage, the type of thing that's not editorialized, that's not commentary, that, you put it up and it is what it is, like that sheds a different kind of a light, and it allows for the spotlight, I think, to be cast wider. The effect of having the data, though, it's not like it's like data to what end? To what end? To what end? To what end? Why do we need the numbers? Why do we need to? It's because the number of deaths in custody is supposed to be zero. When you take people in and you lock them up and you separate them from the unsafety and the dangerousness and the medical neglect and all the other things that we know contribute to deaths in the free world, or, deaths when people are living their lives outside of custody, then it zero is the number that we ought to be talking about when we're in custody. And so data to what end? The spirit of this is you don't stop at the collecting. The collecting and the auditing is like, what are the policies? What are the systems and structures? What are the institutions? Like, what is driving? If this number is anything more than zero, and certainly 990 or whatever the number was in Louisiana in a year was 180, thanks to the Loyola law students, no thanks to the federal government, right? And so part of the data is so that we can have some policies and some systemic change that will make the number zero. For organizers, I think it's also because sometimes we just speak to data for, right, like the legislators and those type of decision makers. But on the ground, some of it, right, is like, well, what are the demands? Sometimes it's just, can we start with transparency? But right, what are when we organize and we're building power and we're making demands and we're thinking about like a new thing, right? Like how to keep each other safe without deaths in custody or any custody. What's the information that we need to know to form strategy and to do that kind of stuff. And so I think the data is really corroborative of people's lived experiences, and we're still just going to get a snapshot because you all said they're underreporting anyway. And so yes.
Well, Liyah, I wonder if you could put sort of a finer point on that for us, right? Because I feel like we've got a lot of folks joining us today who are perhaps, lucky enough to not really have maybe intersected with the criminal legal system before in some way. And when you're talking about lived experience, and your organization is one that does a lot of incredible work with folks who are on the ground, right, who are trying to just close these facilities because it's just beyond redemption. But what does that lived experience look like, right? Like what are, for folks who have eyes and ears on the inside of these places that are some of the most opaque parts of our society, right? Like what are they seeing? Because Bree was talking about preventable deaths. Like, what does that mean, a preventable death?
Yeah, well, Bree spoke to one example, and some of our Louisiana partners, unfortunately have this lived experience, but it involves death by suicide while in jail. When people are supposed to be watched, I mean, we would hope that in the community there's a network, right? There's a network, there's a village, there's wellness, all, but in a locked facility where there are paid staff to at least keep watch, if not take care, then that kind of thing is preventable, and it's an example, and it's not a one-off, unfortunately. So that's part of it. If that's on the back end, and oftentimes I just want to define terms. Also, this is part of Louisiana, but across the nation, jails and the jail that is in Louisiana, and jails in New York are confining people that have not been convicted of any crimes. Now, a death sentence that's not a death sentence ought to be, right? Like, it shouldn't, that we should have a zero tolerance for death in custody, even for people that have been convicted of the most heinous of heinous things that haven't been sentenced to death. But I think it is important to say that some of the lived experience, some of the trauma happens to people who ultimately will have their cases dismissed, who ultimately, will be acquitted by a jury of their peers, and who ultimately will return home after having experienced, trauma on top of trauma. This criminal legal system is a spider web of all of the other societal and systemic failures, chronic, right, medical interruption. If you have medicine on the outside and life-saving, some people need a daily pill or a daily whatever it is, shot, injection, insulin. When I was in Alabama, hepatitis C, these sorts of things. And so access to medicine that you would have and be able to take is another trend and another commonality of a horrible lived experience. But then when we get outside of the facilities, right? If we get outside of the facilities that lock our people up, and we're talking about the other aspects of death in custody, it looks very suspicious. Very suspicious circumstances that oftentimes we can't follow up or probe and get answers to or get oversight for, because and I think you'll get into this later, of the voluntariness of the reporting, the slippery slope of what counts as a death in custody. You say it's COVID, Bree, I say it was pneumonia, so it doesn't count, right? Like that kind of thing. And so I think the lived experience is that everything that is a breakdown of government on the outside is exacerbated on the inside, and it includes physical violence. It includes, just acts of physical and sexual violence by people who are state officials that we pay, and by people who are confined together under the watch of people that we pay who turned a blind eye. So it runs the gamut.
So how hard, and this is probably for David or Bree, but like, how hard is it for a state to comply with the reporting requirements of the Death in Custody Reporting Act?
It's really not that hard. Obviously, we are talking about, at the state and local level, there are somewhere between 18 and 19,000 agencies across the country that would be subject to this law. So there's some legwork that goes into getting the numbers into the Department of Justice. But at root, we are talking about events that should be, as Liyah said, they should be non-existent. One would hope that at the very least they're rare. And when they happen, one would like to think that they would send a shockwave through the agency. And they would be the sort of thing that people would be paying attention to and asking questions about and recording data about whether or not the Death in Custody Reporting Act existed. So, this should not, there is no information that's reported to the Justice Department that should not be captured anyways by an agency that cared one bit, about its core public safety mission. You can also approach that answer a different way and look at the form that people have to fill out. This is not an onerous form. There are 6 questions on it. And we can talk about why there should be more questions on it and make it a little more onerous, maybe. But this is not something that is a stretch by any means. So whatever the barrier here, it is not the technical complexity of getting that information and providing it to the people who need to receive it.
I also think it's really important to, we have a different lens in this society that we look at law enforcement through than anyone else. And I don't understand it, but like the medical industry, which is massively desegregated, some private, some public, right? All these different types of entities that participate in the medical infrastructure in this country, and the obligation to report, regardless of how challenging it is wildly different for medicine and for schools, right, for example, than it is for law enforcement. And I don't understand why that is. And I do wish that, as like in general, and I think we're doing this discussion today, but I think like in general society, I do wish we would take sometimes an external lens to that question, because other folks have figured out how to do this in other sectors, and the expectation is that they must, or their funding is gone.
Mm. Yeah, like you think about the NTSB, right? That shows up whenever there's been, a major accident or some such thing. And there's, a whole literal like post-mortem about what transpired. And I think DCRA is supposed to be a catalyst for that kind of thing within these facilities, but we can't even get information from the states and localities. And I wonder, I would love it if y'all could speak a little bit to, say that DOJ did possess data from these agencies where people have died in police custody and in jails and in prisons. Shouldn't the public have access to that? Will the public have access to that? That's for anybody.
I'm happy to jump in
yeah.
here. I think yes, the public should have access to it, and access broadly, right? I think access to the written report, right? The annual reports, but also, and they do this sometimes, maybe in the consent decree context, but like have someone explain, like have someone be present, show up in community, perhaps in some town halls or something like that, or in some other form, make the information accessible. I think that without the pressure, without the public pressure, at its best, there's going to be a gap between where DOJ and the I say DCRA, I don't know how we're DCRA, where it leaves off, and then zero deaths in custody. And I think the distance between, where we leave off and zero deaths in custody is all about the public, and all about pressuring like lawmakers, prosecute putting pressure on at every pressure point of the criminal legal system, so that the number of people that are even exposed to potential death in custody, that number that we're getting as close to zero for exposure to death in custody. And then once we're talking about deaths in custody, that number is as close to zero. I think, but that leads me, and I'll pass it to David and Bree to tag team in, but that leads me to, like, you know, with the best data, with the best compliance, a $7 billion stick is imagine what we could do if we could fund communities with $7 billion. But like, I think the best of it still begs the question, is there a will, right? Is there a will for the Department of Justice to really police itself? Is there, you know, or does the Department of Justice have a zero tolerance policy or baseline for what's acceptable, or like how many lives, or, you know, how many deaths are we willing to have before we, you know, get to the next level, which is what are the policies that we need to look at to contribute? So I don't have the answer to that, but I query. But I guess I do have an answer to that, and that is the public, the public, and the power of, like, just organized people to hold that gap and to hold fill the space and demand demand life, right? Especially when our loved ones are locked up.
Well, and quickly to that end, I think one of our colleagues can put this in the chat, but we do have a petition to get folks to join to demand that DOJ fully implement this law. But David, I saw you took yourself off mute. If you're going to jump in here.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, everything Liyah just said about the power of transparency is spot on. And unfortunately, my role in the conversation is to have the bad news of DOJ is currently doing pretty much everything in its power to make sure this data doesn't make it out to the public. You know, we've seen over the last, again, you know, 8+ years since the law was passed, a downward trajectory in how DOJ has approached transparency in the context of DCRA. Back in 2016, they said they would proactively release a whole bunch of data and get pretty granular about it, maybe make some alterations to protect the identities of individuals. Then during the Trump administration, we saw DOJ say they wouldn't release the data. Maybe people could ask for it under the Freedom of Information Act. And now under the Biden administration, we're seeing DOJ say that they're straight up not allowed to release the data. And that argument is difficult to buy on its face without going into the details. It's especially difficult to buy in the context of everything else that DOJ has said about what they would or wouldn't make public. I can't imagine if this were a clear-cut case where they weren't allowed to do something, it would have taken them 8 years to realize they couldn't do it. It just, you know, there are a lot of problems with DOJ. I can't imagine them truly missing that back in 2016. So, you know, and, you know, I'm actually I was just reading this morning, DOJ's latest status update on DCRA implementation. And we've seen for the first time, I think, a new reason for why they don't want to release data, which is that they're worried about it harming the integrity of the data that they collect. And it's true that one would imagine a police department doesn't want to release data that makes itself look bad. It's not true that the solution to that is to keep the data secret. The solution to that is for the police department to not kill someone in the first place. And nothing we've tried so far seems to have been able to spur that realization. So maybe releasing the data would. So, you know, again, we're in a situation where DOJ is saying they realize that this is an important issue. They think transparency is important, but they haven't made that final connection that transparency is actually what's going to make change happen.
Thanks, David. Bree, I'd like to ask you a question that, you know, you can sort of put on your hat as the person at Leadership Conference who handles a variety of criminal legal system reform issues. How does basic data on how many people are dying in custody and why they died fit into the larger context of accountability for policing in our country?
Oh, Lord. Well, I mean, it fits perfectly into the pattern that we see all over the place when it comes to law enforcement data, criminal legal system data. I'm really glad that Liyah surfaced the question about, I'm going to phrase it as who watches the watchman, right? Like this idea that, is there a will at the DOJ, right? David covered this too. Is there a will at the DOJ to really show what's happening in law enforcement? And I mean, it's something that I see at the local level. It's something that I see in the work generally across all different pieces of the timeline of someone's journey, right, through the criminal legal system. You can see stuff in pretrial, you can see stuff before pretrial and policing, you can see stuff in sentencing and reentry. So no, the DOJ in general is not good at collecting data, comprehensive data. Law enforcement agencies are not good at providing comprehensive, clear, complete data. Another example that I point to frequently as another issue area is the FBI's use of force collection. It is incredibly narrow. It is hyper-focused on the most physically egregious of incidences, which are important. Like, let me be clear, right? Like, I do want data on law enforcement officers killing people, firing their firearms, creating serious bodily injury. But there are so many other ways that law enforcement agencies and law enforcement officers use physical force in communities, particularly Black communities, more broadly in Black and Brown communities, in a way that causes widespread trauma. And the thing that I always think about is, if I am walking down the street and someone physically takes me to the ground, and I am not expecting it, even if I am, that's quite scary, I will remember that incident for the rest of my life, right? It'll be something that I can point to as a traumatic event. If that person is an armed agent of the state, and it doesn't happen to me one time, but several times, or to me and to others, and I see it, to family member, like, and takedowns are, I use that as an example because takedowns are one of the things that are missing from the federal use of force collection. And we see this across the board. And unfortunately, this has been on my mind a lot lately, but law enforcement collection is pretty bad. The policing collection is bad. Courts data collection is like, bad probably isn't the word. It's like worse than that. It's like paper files in a box. So I think that what we have here, right, DCRA, use of force collection, all these different pieces are a manifestation of not only racism in our country, classism in our country, things that go wrong in that way in the very basis. But it's also, this is what it looks like when we allow an entire sector to abdicate responsibility for reporting what they do to the public. And I think the movement, at least in part right now, is about connecting those dots and making more and more noise. So it is harder and harder and harder for law enforcement agencies to hide by simply underperforming in data collection. That's worked for a really long time. It's been a very effective tool. And I think due to, like Liyah said, the fact that there's now other additional data points to people's lived experience, like cell phone, video footage, body worn camera footage, which we can have a different conversation about that. But like, it's making harder for law enforcement to just not say anything, and then eventually people give it up.
First, I want to make sure that folks who are joining us today can feel comfortable to put something in the chat or raise a hand if you have a question. We definitely want you to get in on the conversation here and appreciate some of the comments that have been in the chat so far. I don't want us to veer too far into sort of like despondency over, talking about this very, very serious issue. So I'd love to know if you all can point us to some places where, oh, let me back up. We know that the government isn't great at this. And we know that law enforcement agencies have no sort of incentive to be compliant. But but there are maybe private entities that have started to undertake some of this. And so could you all speak a little bit to what you've seen that's been sort of like good research that demonstrates this is how you do it? Here's your roadmap. David.
Sure, I'll take the first pass, but I hope everyone will fill in the gaps. I mean, so there are different places where you can look for promising examples. There are states that do better work than the federal government. I want to say at the outset, I'm wary of pointing to any one program or project as a perfect example, because I don't know that, at least in the government program context, there is a perfect example. But places that are doing it better than DOJ. California has been tracking some of this data in one way or another for a few decades. Texas, bizarrely enough, makes more detailed information available to the public than the Department of Justice. Indiana actually started publishing some data proactively as part of its compliance efforts with DCRA. That's one promising example of the federal requirements actually spurring states to be proactive about sharing their own data with the public as well as with DOJ. Again, I don't think any of these have solved the issue of, totally accurate, totally transparent data, but it's at least a start. And then on the non-governmental side, I think both Liyah and Bree have mentioned researchers, law schools, newspapers that are doing some of this. There's the Washington Post data collection. There's the Mapping Police Violence data collection, both of which DOJ has actually started using to check the accuracy of data that states are reporting, which is something we've been urging them to do for quite some time. So that is,
we can give credit when credit is due.
Exactly. I mean, yes, and if we talk about paths forward on DCRA, DOJ has started very belatedly laying the groundwork for doing some things that would help. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. But again, I think there are lots of examples of data efforts that are doing more than DOJ is doing right now.
Thanks, David. I think we've got a couple questions from our audience. First, I see David Copper has a hand raised. David, if you want to get in. Take yourself off mute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank all y'all for your wonderful information. I have a couple questions that probably would be short answered. Are commercial prisons required to report?
Yes.
Private prisons?
They are.
Okay. How about, are executions counted as death in custody?
They are not, though the Justice Department does provide that data more consistently in a separate collection.
Good. One more. What's the money for? Maybe you could, address that a little later in the presentation. What is it to improve the facility? When there's deaths in the prison or a facility, or is that just part of their regular budget?
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I've been talking a lot, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about the funding question. So the grant pool that the penalty would apply to is basically general purpose federal assistance for state, local, and local police and corrections agencies. There are kind of 9 buckets that they have to use the money for, but it covers pretty much the full scope of law enforcement and corrections activity. So, withholding some of that money, I think, would be an incentive. There is also, I think, an argument to be made that requiring some of that money to go toward improving compliance with death in custody reporting and other requirements could be a useful stick.
Thanks, David. Something I've been thinking about in this conversation is, we would like to get to the stick portion of the program here, right? Where non-compliant jurisdictions are actually given some kind of incentive to become compliant with the reporting. But then I go back to what Liyah said at the outset here, right? Which is like, this is sort of the minimum of what we could be doing. So Liyah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, for your thoughts on states that are not compliant. What should be happening in these jurisdictions?
Yeah, we partner with groups in a couple of non-compliant states, unfortunately, non-compliant, but they receive some of that JAG burn funding. So it's a twofold. If they were non-compliant and had 0 deaths in custody, we would still want them to comply, but it'd be 0 deaths in custody. The non-compliant and the deaths in custody is like, that's the intersection. That's the issue. And a point taken by the last question, I think it was David Copper that asked about funding from this to that. Something that strikes me as easy for me, but I'm not in the bureaucracy of the federal government, but something that seems like an obvious thing to do for non-compliant states is to eliminate that middle tier between the Department of Justice and the localities, right? So if I take Louisiana, for example, but there are other examples, there's one agency, I forget what it's called, but like the law enforcement, LCCE, law enforcement, let's just say law enforcement collection, force. That one body collects the data from all the local parishes, right? So there's no reason to have so much bureaucracy and so many layers at the cost to the federal taxpayers is really what it is. And so it seems to me that probably the whole system could use maybe that middle tier done away with or restructured. But for non-compliant states, I would think that the federal government, the Department of Justice would want less of a buffer and less of an intermediary, and might want to pay closer attention and have a more hands-on, if you will, approach to what is happening in those places. I think that is a minimum thing to do. And I think that I don't know the answer, FOIA is a place and it stops, at some place, and then the public records in each state. But I think some query about like the public records part of it, right? I'm back to the power, right? The power of the people to demand that at a minimum they collect the data and report it. So there seems to me to be something there to do. But I think if we're talking about non-compliance, and again, we're not talking about non-compliance, you can't keep people safe, but we're talking about non-compliance. You can't tell us about what is happening in your custody. That seems to me that the DOJ would maybe want to start by positioning itself to be on the front lines and not having that state buffer. That state buffer. So I'll just stop there. I'm a defunder. I think it's never, I think that we have a finite amount of taxes, of federal taxes, especially while, you know, the corporations are not getting taxed to where we need them to be with the billionaires. But if we're not going to actually defund it's not just states, right? ICE and like these offending federal agencies, then I think that looking to see where the federal government can make investments outside of confinement, while the agencies get themselves together or whatever, or we think of something new, that might be another place to start.
Thanks, Liyah. I'm cognizant of our time, that we've got about 3 minutes left. So I would love to just maybe go quickly round robin and give each of you about 30 seconds to tell us what else we should know. And so going around, let's see, counterclockwise on my screen, it starts with Bree.
Yeah, I think I just want to uplift what Liyah's been saying about like the power of the people. Like, I think that we have been successful at making it really uncomfortable for DOJ to be doing so poorly on DCRA, and it is resulting in some movement and upheaval. I think, you know, no data without stories, no stories without data, working together, they are so powerful. I will not forget how powerful that hearing last fall was, the PSI hearing on DCRA. And it was because you had researchers in the room with people with lived experience with losing loved ones in custody. And it was extremely, you could feel it through the screen, like it shook the room. And what we have going in our favor is that this criminal legal structure makes no kind of sense. And we just have to point that out to folks and keep uplifting it over and over and over again. And it will, I think, result in shifts that are positive.
Thanks, Bree. And we should note too that some of those folks that made that hearing possible, that Senate hearing possible, from the East Baton Rouge Prison Parish Prison Reform Coalition, I think were joining us today. So thank you to all of them for being a part of this. David, your 30 seconds. What do people need to know?
I think I just emphasized that the solutions here are not complicated. They're not unknown. We don't need to discover new things to make this work. We need to find the will. And sometimes it can be hard to filter will through bureaucracy, but that's what this comes down to. It's people who have the power to do something about it, realizing that they need to do it. And that will take a groundswell, but it is not a technical issue.
Thanks, David. And Liyah will give you the quasi last word.
Yeah, for me, it is that systemic racism, right, and racialized capitalism, those isms is what contribute to these failures. And because we're talking about predominantly Black and Brown people, because we're talking about mostly poor and low income people, because we're talking about our trans friends and people with disabilities and some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people who are at risk, right? At risk of death in custody. That is what has allowed such a colossal failure. And for us to be having a conversation in 2023 about the bare minimum of the bare minimum that we need to even get to the, right, to get to what end, which is to make sure that if you're gonna lock people up, that they can come out alive. So yeah, I think the systemic racism part of it and who we're talking about contributes to all of what we've discussed over the last hour.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Liyah. I really want to encourage folks to check out our report on DCRA, even though this could be a pretty technical issue. I think that the three of you have made this sort of a very like relatable and comprehensible kind of discussion around a law and have reminded us of like fundamentally what's at stake here. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon.